Hey, everybody, welcome back to a Contest Prep University Peak Intel session. I'm here with Austin Kiergaard. I'm Joe Klemczewski. We're going to talk about Contest Day Diagnostics. This is a little bit of a sequel to one of the things that we did very early on. I think it was our first Peak Intel, Austin, called Stage Hydration. And I would say to anybody who listens to this and you think there's anything interesting or helpful, follow up and go watch that one because we really went through a lot of physiology and how intracellular water works, how it gets into your body. I'm sure we'll cover some of that today. But I really want to theme this in a way that we're looking at the entire peak week process as a lead-in to contest day and the most important skill you could ever have as a competitor. Even if you are coached, for you to understand what's happening and perhaps communicate this information to a coach, diagnosing exactly how you look at any given moment and why. If you need to change anything, if you're looking a little flat or full or something just doesn't look right, you have to be able to know why. And I would argue, because I was that person when I was 20 years old, 21, 22, 23, all of my first contests, where I could never figure that out. That's what really pulled me into the science of nutrition and contest prep. So, uh, give me just a little bit of a feel for where you want to go. How do you feel this topic relates to the average person on contest day, Austin?
I think it relates because in the past 12 months, I know between you and myself, our D1 club group, um, my clients, I know you've shared some stuff with your clients. The flat and full is a very common discussion. So I think, when we're going through things today, people will be able to take the information that we're talking about and apply it to what is flat, what is full. Um, because judges oftentimes tell athletes, you look good, but you looked a little flat. Come in fuller, come in fuller, come in fuller. And I know we've done a discussion about that, but like, what does that mean? What does that look like? How are people still coming in flat? Or what is too full and what is too flat? What are mistakes people are probably making? I think those questions that people have, they will get some of those answers today.
I rewatched that stage hydration episode we did, and I put in a couple of photos of a client of mine who had competed. Before we met, we had competed against each other, and he was just super spilled over, super flat. He had overcarbed, he was dehydrated, and he was just a mess. I mean, he was out of the top 10, just didn't even belong on stage. As a pro bodybuilder, it was a disaster. We talked, and he decided to work with me for his next contest, where we again competed against each other a few weeks later. And at the exact same body weight, same body comp, it was unbelievable how he just looked like a brick wall. Super, super tight, very hydrated. And even on contest day, you of that first show, he would not have been able to told you what went wrong. He was just clueless. He had not heard about the kind of water and sodium and so forth diversions that you and I have brought to the industry versus the old school type methodology. Um, I have another story just real quick, just while we're talking about flat versus full. A client of mine who has probably as good at genetics as anybody I've ever worked with. He is phenomenal. He has unbelievable muscle belly fullness. He can get lean. He has a tiny, tiny waist, huge, just billowing lats and delts and a full chest. He could be a great IFBB pro men's physique competitor. And after working with me for a year, as I often suggest clients do, he decided to go off and work with somebody else because he just thought he could get another perspective. He had an opportunity to work with an IFBB pro who he idolized. He said, "Look, this guy is like a hero to me. He's got an opening. I love what you and I have done, Joe, but I've got to take that." Well, he just competed. And again, I use the word disaster. Uh, I just looked at him and I thought that can't be right. Like that has to be a photo from 5 years ago or 10 years ago. He looked so bad. He looked so small. He looked so soft. And I went through, his post and read that, his new coach had him really aggressive. We really want to come in full, so he we carved up massively, like took a real roll of the dice. And then, of course, because this is your typical IFBB pro, he dehydrated him. So I swear he looked his arms look like a 12-year-old little boy's, and this is a guy who's 220 pounds, looking on stage. And I thought, man, he can't even tell. Like even after a year of working with me, he looks at himself and says, well, we're just a little off that day. So when you are assessing when a client of yours wakes up on contest day, sends you those first photos, what are you looking for, and how do you then want them to progress into the morning?
Well, I want to make sure that they're still lean. And what I mean by that is you'll have old coaching protocols that have people do a bunch of cheat meals or something like that the day before, or they'll carb up super aggressively. And towards the end of the Friday evening, they look kind of soft, so they're not as lean. Um, and then their athletes will wake up that same way. They just don't look as lean as they did on Thursday or Wednesday that week of. So I look to make sure that they're still very tight. Muscles are pushing against the skin a little bit more, and then it's just kind of small amount of feedings throughout the day. And I'm having them check in with me throughout the day just to make sure that they're not sitting around too long. I think sometimes people sit too much while they're eating, and then that can cause some issues. But there is a place for being relaxed. So, anyways, looking at my athlete, I want to make sure that they are fuller than they were the day before, but that they're still lean. So even if I have an athlete they're getting a little bit softer in the evening on Friday, that's okay because I know they're going to wake up the next day and they're going to look a little bit bigger and they're still going to be tight. That's what I expect to see. If something crazy happened and we're not seeing that, then we work on some different things to remedy that situation.
Mhm. So I'll give you an example of two of my clients that just came to mind when you were speaking, who are competing this weekend. We are recording this on a Thursday, so we are 2 days out from their particular contest day. I'll give you an example of a female and a male. The male, dieted between 150, 200 grams of carbs a day through the bulk of his transition, maybe 40, 50 grams of fat a day. Well, now he entered peak week at around 300 grams of carbs. And so we've already gone through a bit of a metabolic building phase where his food intake is high enough. He's been very stable, and I've been looking for ways because I'm diagnosing how he looks morning and evening all of peak week so that I know when we get to contest day and I see his photos exactly where we've been, how we've been looking, and where we need to go from there. So the last couple of days, for example, maybe the first 3 or so days, we stayed at 300 grams of carbs. We went up to 325, went up to 350, and I started to see his weight just climb a tad, like a couple ounces one day, a couple ounces the next day, and some of that is obviously, a variable. It's not always weighing, an increase of glycogen and water retention, that sort of thing, but I'm also using photos to compare that to. And we got to last night, and I love his fullness. I'm looking at his back, I'm looking at his shoulders and chest, and the fullness is there. Our progressive linear load is there. But I said, we may be getting to the ceiling. Like, I need to see photos right away, and I need you to take photos for me tonight. Like, I'm going to bed, but take photos because I need to compare how you look tonight to how you look in the morning. And he was much tighter again this morning, and his weight was down a couple of ounces again. So I knew we could at least stay where we were. I still am diagnosing that we've kind of hit a glycogen ceiling. Again, a guy dieting on 150 grams of carbs, now he's at 350, very stable. So I made that call to stay here today. I'll wait and see how he looks and how he weighs in tomorrow morning as well as tonight again. And we may go up a little bit or we may stay the same. But I want him on contest day to have that same look that I saw this morning, where I know he was a little bit full and almost spilling over at night, but then had recaptured it in the morning.
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that?
No, I would say it's a similar approach for me as well. I progressive linear load. And I like to have Thursday and Friday as kind of seeing where they're at. Thursday it might be their highest carb day of the rest of the week. Friday, again, it depends. Like if it looks like they're hitting that kind of that glycogen load, or reaching that cap, excuse me, like you said, and making sure that like, hey, you're softening up a little bit, but guess what? We have tomorrow, we have Friday to see how you're looking. If you look how I expect you to look, then we're good. Then we can repeat the same day because we know we're right there. Or if you start dropping, like I've had some people, they've dropped a couple of pounds overnight, like they're a little bit lighter, then we might still have a little room for a little bit more food. It kind of depends on like what category they're competing in too, like depending on how their look is, like what's the look the judges are looking for, like is it okay if we give them a little more food because it really shouldn't impact their look that much, they should look similar, or they can afford more food. Some of it, like you said, it's just diagnosing it each day, even each hour really, as we get within those final 48 hours of the show.
Hmm. So let's skip ahead just because I do want to talk about diagnostics on contest day. Let's say tomorrow we stay linear. We're capped out at 350 grams. His weight is about the same. Now it depends what time of day he's going to be on stage. Because sometimes it's the afternoon. A lot of contests now, live judging could start a little bit late or it could be early in the morning. And so if I look at him and it's perfect, everything is fine, and we've scheduled the right, meals and the food that we want, and then something goes wrong, meaning he sends me photos a couple hours into the day, and all of a sudden I see him looking flat. What would be your immediate thought with what I've just told you? His weight was the same on contest morning. We've been holding weight. What questions would you ask or what information would you need to diagnose why he's looking flat a couple hours into contest day?
I would ask him how much water and how much intake he has had. And when I say intake, how many meals have you had and how much water have you had? So one thing, and before I throw it back to you, because this is actually like a perfect segue, I'm looking over because I wrote this down to make sure I don't forget to talk about this. But when we're talking about like getting flat, especially like on show day, when we look at things like osmolality and tonicity of cells, one of those things is called a like hypertonic. I'm going to get a little sciencey here for a minute. But what that means is we have a lot of solutes in a solution. And when that happens, water leaves our cells. We get cell shrinking. We have a hypotonic solution. We have a lot more solutes inside of our cells. Therefore, water goes into the cells. We get more cell swelling. And then we have isotonic, which is kind of like it sounds. It's kind of everything is neutral, right? So if we are eating lots of food that has solutes in it, let's say, and we're not drinking a lot of fluids, what's happening? We've got things coming out of the cells, cell shrinking, right? So we need to make sure we have a nice balance of consuming enough water, enough fluids, and consuming enough of the solutes, so things that we're getting from our food. So that's why I'm asking those questions, and I just wanted to bring that up because I did not want to forget that, and I felt it was just a nice segue. So that's kind of my answer. I'll throw it back to you, Joe, so we can keep talking about your client on show day.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So uh, I'm also looking at the food intake. I want to make sure, but for my clients, we're generally going to have about the same meals. Matter of fact, assuming that we've had a Thursday and a Friday that were pretty linear, I'm going to want him to use the same first meal or two that he already is used to. Like those are the exact foods in the exact amounts I want. So other solutes besides something like glucose is are sodium and the minerals, sodium, potassium, etc. So for water to follow those solutes into the cell, you've got to have the solutes and you've got to have the hydration. So this is where a lot of people mess up in a bad way. Even if you're just running at 50%, hey Joe, I didn't dehydrate. I had a gallon and a half of water the day before the show. But then in the morning, you get a little nervous and you start just kind of sipping water. You're not drinking the same amount. On a normal day, maybe you had down 32 ounces in your first hour of waking up. You had some water, then you had some coffee, then you had, fluid with your meal. All of a sudden on contest day, you get a little nervous and you start pulling that back. So now you don't have water. Uh, Another thing that often comes up is we don't know as a competitor and sometimes a coach where you are in transition day to day. So just like I was asking and looking at photos Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, if he started losing, you mentioned a client, may lose 2 pounds overnight. Well, why would they lose 2 pounds overnight? Obviously, that's not body fat. What if your client woke up on contest day 2 pounds down? What would you assume happened?
I mean, a couple things. They might have slept in a little bit longer than usual, so there might have been some more fasting or emptying time from their gut. There could just be their body is just using what's going on. They're burning through what they're eating. Did they have an extra movement versus not? Did they drink less fluid? There's a few things that go through my mind at that point that I would ask.
So exactly, all great things you have to ask to come up with a proper diagnosis. But another thing I would ask is, were you urinating a lot? Like, did you get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom more often than normal? Because we may have just hit a little bit of a threshold dip in carbohydrate intake. Like maybe with that flat linear load we had, in my client going back to Wednesday, Thursday, Friday being the same, that doesn't mean that on Friday they didn't use more energy. Maybe they were running around, they're in a different city doing, all the prep for the contest and anxiety is kicking in. Maybe they just really now are losing those solutes. And when solutes leave your body, you're as you said, you're burning through that glycogen. Now water is going to leave your body. You're going to urinate it out. So I'm even asking questions like that. Your frequency, the volume of urination, the color of urination, is it normal? Is it you know much less, much increased than normal? Um, so I would ask you first because I know what my clients' tendencies are. Your normal client, let's say out of 100 clients competing this year, how many times do you just run through contest day and everything was perfect versus how many times are you having to fine tune this or that, add this, decrease that? Like what's a typical process for you on contest day?
I don't know if it's ever ran perfect because there's just always seems to be something that changes. I mean, and for example, like on show day, an athlete's maybe like, hey, they're thinking I'm going to go on at 10 a.m. Well, they changed everything. No, I don't go on until like noon or 1. Okay, so that makes a big difference because now we might be able to afford to get another meal in you, right? Like, what are you doing right now? Are you just sitting? Are you walking around pacing and stressing out? So I'm fortunate enough that sometimes I'm able to be at my client shows so I can kind of see what's going on and asking those questions. When I can't be, though, we're constantly sending each other messages and I'm asking them like where they're at, how are things progressing from for the show? Like, are they on time? What like how many meals have they had? There's also a lot of prep talk, right? I'm making sure they have enough food with them, so I'm assuming they've got enough meals that they're not forgetting anything or not forgetting to eat. The one that you and I we've mentioned a few times already, but it still is a reoccurring theme with almost every one of my clients, is they're still very timid and very nervous to drink water
Mhm.
because they're scared they're going to have to pee on stage, which again, when we were talking about like osmolality and tonicity and solutes and all of these things, we know how important water is. So much so that, like you had mentioned earlier about, we've got sodium, we've got potassium, we've got glucose. These things need to get into the cells. Water is best friends with sodium. We know sodium and water, glucose going into the cells. That's what we need. So I always try to make sure that people are drinking enough water. But again, almost all of my clients, they just get super scared. They're telling me they're drinking water, but then I'm looking at their physique and I'm like, did you drink this much or did you just have a few sips? And it's like, well, I had a few sips. Yeah, that's why I said I want you to drink this much because I can tell now you are flattening out a little bit. You're not looking like you did a few hours ago. We need to get that fluid back in you. We need you to get moving. Don't just sit on the ground for 4 hours and eat and drink a bunch of stuff. That's not going to help you at this point. So that's kind of some of the things that I go through with them.
Yeah, and I'm going to make sure we provide some photos for the editing of this because I want to make sure people can see the difference. Um, One of our coaches in our Flexible Dieting Institute Professional Coach Association had a client competing, and he was sending me photos. Hey, what do you think about how he looks right now? And he just looked horribly flat. I mean, just
Mhm.
horrifically flat. And first of all, when this coach said, "How does he look?" I had to say, I need photos from yesterday. I need photos from the day before. I need photos from this. And so then I got a little bit more context. And then I had to say, how much water is this person having day in and day out versus today on contest day? And then the carbohydrates. Like those are the kind of things you have to know. And for a coach to not even have that information ready shows me they're not even thinking in that direction, right? Like those are all the things you should already have on top of mind, and it's just instant information. But we just got down to the point that yes, you're not going to fill somebody out on contest day with carbs. It takes 24 to 48 hours for glucose through your digestive system to be assimilated into glycogen. So there's two components to this. Uh, Most people make the mistake, oh, I'm looking flat. Let me shove in more food. I need more food. More food, more food, more food will make me fuller. Well, it's going to make your gut fuller, and you're going to start getting some glucose into the vascular system because now it's being transported around your body. And as you said, water follows solutes. So now water is going to be leaving the muscle cells because the glucose isn't in the muscle cells. It's in your digestive system, it's in your vascular system. I mean, that is the biggest mistake I see people make is they're a little flat. They're not thinking hydration or minerals, which we get to next, and so they just try to overdo food. I had a great question in our Contest Prep University D1 club. Somebody asked, well, then why even have carbs on contest day if you can't assimilate that into glycogen? And the reason is because that is an excellent question, is it's to spare that glycogen that's already there. Because if you get into that place where you are starting to use more energy, you're in a calorie deficit that you didn't want, you left that neutral position or even that little bit of a loading position, and now you're in a deficit. Now you're using that muscle glycogen, you're not replacing it, and so water is going to leave the muscle cells and you're going to get flat again. So you really have to have a super stable, predictable food intake. Whatever your plan is with carbs, whether you're still into a load or you've kind of leveled off, you have to know where you are because that's going to be one big part of how water is directed. But now let's say it's contest day and we do need to be a little bit fuller. You're not going to overdo carbohydrates. So how about using minerals to direct water into the muscle cell? Why would you and I do that, and why does it work? How does it work?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. You mean like why use sodium, why use potassium, why using um those types of things? Is that what you're
Yeah,
talking
why on contest day when a lot of competitors are eating no sodium whatsoever,
about?
why would you say no, we need that in a strategic way, in a strategic amount?
Yeah, good question. Okay, I follow where you're going with this. So yeah, like we kind of mentioned earlier, right? We need so sodium and potassium specifically, those things are so highly responsible for like fluid balance. It is incredibly important. We know that based on like the sodium glucose uh, transport, excuse me, that's going to help pull the glucose into the cell. So like you had mentioned earlier, right? We've got a lot of glucose going on in the blood. We have um, storage, glycogen storage already from what we've been trying to load throughout the week. So now on show day, if we're not consuming enough salt or sodium, excuse me, those are not the same thing. And it gets confusing, but they are not. Um, but what I'm trying to say is that we want to make sure that with the sodium and the potassium, we're getting enough electrolytes, we're getting enough of these things to help pull the glucose into the cells, and we also need to drink water, as we've been repeating over and over again with the water. But we need to make sure that that's still happening on show day because those are going to pull the nutrients into the cells. They are going to keep our fluid balance at a nice kind of homeostatic playing field, if you will. And unfortunately, what I see a lot of, and I'm sure you do too, and I think that's why you brought this up, is that we see a lot of people will do cheat meals but no water, or they'll say we want you to eat but only have like just a little bit of water, or no salt or seasonings, and just eat plain chicken breast and rice and that's it, and have a few sips of water. Well, now we're not consuming enough of these things, the sodium and the potassium, like you had mentioned, to help get that into our cells so we can actually start getting a nice pump. We can start making the muscle look fuller. We can start to get a little bit more of the cell swelling versus the cell shrinking, right? We don't want us to look flat and small on stage. We want us to have just a nice, happy balance of we're getting glucose and potassium into the cells. Sodium is that driver, it kicks it in, then it exits out of the cell once the glucose is in. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that on show day so we can get you to that quote full look that we've all been trying to achieve and that we can get that pump going.
So you said a couple things that are really critical there. One, you're alluding to the fact that the muscle look being full or flat has everything to do with water, period. And we get water into those cells, going all the way back to what you said about the solutes either drawing water in or out of the cell. There is that fluid exchange, that osmolarity between cell membrane, and that is 100% mediated by those uh, ion charges that are mediated by those minerals or those solutes. But back to carbohydrates, even though we're not assimilating, you're not going to get the full kind of pump, that you would like, maybe in a normal context, your workout during your normal week, because of the glycogen that's already in that muscle. Any carbohydrate you've at least consumed at that meal, anything circulating in your bloodstream in the form of glucose, if you have the sodium transport and the fluid, then that can be directed into the cell as well. So the glucose is going into the muscle cell. It's not yet in the form of glycogen, but all that is doing is mediating the flow of water. So again, you're stacking solutes, so to speak. You're getting all of the solutes possible heading in the direction you want, which is into the muscle cell, which also is dictated by having a stimulus. So for you to actually, do a set of push-ups or do a, set of curls or some shoulder laterals or something, just to see if even briefly with just 30 seconds of movement, like did you get some kind of response? Did you feel like your shoulders, your pecs got a little bit fuller, or do you just feel almost crampy and flat? And I think we know what that feels like, right? Where you just can't get any blood flow. If you feel like that, you are dehydrated. And you may not have even the mineral base or the solutes to get fluid into the muscle cell where we want.
So
So, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was I had a perfect example of that. So this was late September. I was at the OCB Yorton, so that's the OCB's World Championships, and I had a client competing that day. I was backstage. It's a female competitor, and she had told me that she ate all of the meals that she was supposed to. She had been drinking water, but she's like, I'll be honest, she's like, I haven't drank very much water. I was like, well, how much is like what? She's like, I don't think I barely drink any water. And I was like, okay, we need you to get water in you now because she was about to go on stage in a little bit. She was starting to pump up, and I was like, I want you to do a pump, drink some water, do a pump, drink some water. I'm just basically making her take sips and sips and sips of water, and she kept pounding the water. We had maybe 20, 30 minutes before she was going to go on stage. And then all of a sudden she's like, holy crap, I feel like tight. Like she could finally like get a pump. And I could even see it in her too. I could start to see some vascularity starting to come up to the skin and things like that. Like things were finally going, but I'm like, this is why it's important to drink water. Like we had to really force that in you, and she still probably could have looked a little bit better if we would have, had more water in her. So, anyways, when you said that, that's where my brain went. I was like, right here's an opportunity for that. So,
So if we consider, and I want to keep summarizing diagnostics, coming back to that phrase, uh, I don't think, I'm going to make a pretty dogmatic statement here, but I don't think there's any such thing as having too much water. I mean, what happens on contest day if I accidentally drink 2 gallons of water, Austin? What's going to happen?
well, again, it depends on if they're eating or not, right? When we were talked about like cell swelling and things like that, are we drinking so much that we're quote waterlogged and then we're just peeing constantly the whole time? Not necessarily a bad thing, but is it going to be to a point where are you eating enough to sustain the fluid that you're drinking? That would be my only little bugaboo. But yeah, I think for this like the sake of what we're discussing, I feel like it would be really hard to just drink a bunch of water and say, well, you're still going to look good. Like worst case scenario, I guess is what I'm saying. So I don't think that there's too many things that would, if someone's like, I had a gallon of water before I got on stage, I wouldn't be worried about that.
Yeah.
It,
Because you're only, as you said, you're only going to urinate it out. Now there is a caveat to that. if you did something like that in inordinate amount, way more water than is normal for you, then you are going to leach even more minerals out of your body. So now sodium, potassium, solutes are going to leave your body. And so, that's not a fair thing to throw into this conversation. I just wanted to use it as a way to explain that when you have your solutes controlled and accounted for, here's how much carbohydrate I had Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I know what my weight has done. I'm finding a range. I'm trying to get up to the ceiling. I'm trying to get up the top level of glycogen that I can hold without spilling over. And if I start to bleed out glycogen, then I'm going to know because I'm getting flatter and my weight is coming down because now my muscle tissue doesn't have the solutes, the glycogen to hold water in. So maybe the night before the contest, maybe the morning of the contest, I need to rectify that a little bit. But all having too much water, quote in air quotes, too much water would do for you is meaning you're going to urinate it out. It does nothing invaluable for you. But if you don't have enough, then you're going to be flat. And it's hard to get irreparably flat because water can get into muscle tissue pretty quickly, especially if you have that mineral substrate to get it in. But let me talk for a second because some people will undoubtedly do this. They will try to get fuller with too much food. They'll try to shove too much food. Some coach will tell them when you wake up on Saturday morning, have this, 1,000 grams of carbs, have this jar of peanut butter, do something. And so if somebody starts to spill over from literal overloading of carbohydrates, what can you have them do to rectify that? And maybe even how do you diagnose that?
Yeah, if they had too much and they're starting to spill over, I try to tell people like we still need to push fluids. We still need to, I like to have people move. Just because as they're moving and as they're pushing those fluids, they're still getting those solutes into the cells. They're still using some of that fuel. Like it can be rectified, but it depends on how much they've spilt over too, and it depends on like how long do they have before they go on stage. I know you shared a story with me about how something like that happened to you similarly, and you had made some corrections. I don't remember if you were in New York City or where it was at the time, but it would be a similar approach to that. Like I would say, let me see how you're looking. Oh yeah, you are spilling over. Like let's still push the fluids. Let's get you moving, and we will start to move those solutes around, and we'll start to burn through some of what you have, and you will start to tighten up.
So again, diagnostically, without even noticing it, you went through a litany of if this, then that, if then that. You went to a place where it's like, okay, I'm assuming, we know where your carbohydrate levels were, and now you got too much carbohydrate. Your first inclination was keep water going in. We need that because now you don't want to do two things that are bad. You don't want to overcarb and then get flatter because you're dehydrated. Exactly what I mentioned with my friend I competed against. So what you just said was perfect. You need to move. You ate too much carbohydrates. You need to burn some calories. You need to use those hopefully before you get on stage so that then you can rectify that little bit of spillover. A lot of spillover is the person who has way too much carbohydrate the day or two before the contest. And now it's going to take you days. You won't look your best until you've moved and worked out for 2 or 3 days. But in that very subtle over carbing from one meal, I'll go back and tell you that story that you're bringing up for me. It was the best I'd ever looked as a pro. I was as lean as I've ever been, striated glutes, just hard as nails, and I had even done a very very cautious, subtle peaking process where I literally stayed at 100 grams of carbs 7 days in a row. I'm carb sensitive to begin with. I just thought I'm going to stay really lean like that, and then contest morning I'll have a bigger meal and I'll fill up. Obviously, I didn't know quite as much as I know now because we can't assimilate glycogen like that, right? So here's what happened. I went and I had a big baked potato and like some ground beef or steak or something for breakfast. And I just thought, this is fine. I mean, I'm perfect. I've looked great all week long. I ate that meal. And about an hour later, I took my shirt off and I just felt like dying. I mean, you could grab like shit on my abs. Like it was like I had gone from 4% body fat to 10. Just spill over with that much water because now those carbohydrates I wasn't used to had, they were in transition. They went into my stomach and now they're getting into my vascular system. They're on their way into muscle tissue. But in that process, that's what spillover is. Water follows solute, so water's following that glucose, and it's interstitially, throughout my body, under, between my skin and my muscle, and I just looked like absolute dog shit. I had about 3 hours to go before I was on stage. And so I just went outside in the heat and I was walking and sweating and just, it wasn't the sweat, it was the movement. It was using that glucose, doing everything I could, drinking water, as you said, I'm replacing the water I'm using because the problem is the glucose, the transitory glucose. So by the time I got on stage, I was back to looking perfect. And I've got those photos back from that prejudging, and it is still the best I've ever looked on a stage. But it was a wild fucking 3 hours to get to that point because I had screwed up from a spillover perspective. Luckily, just subtly enough. But if I didn't have all of that data of what I had done all the way through and why, I wouldn't have known what to do to rectify it. And that's the biggest point of today's session.
Yeah, and you knew what to do. So, some of the people that maybe are coaching themselves and listening to this, maybe they wouldn't know what to do in that situation, or they just wouldn't have a voice. And hopefully somebody that is listening, they have a coach and they can be there for them and say, here's what you have to do. Here's if then what now, what should we be doing? So I thought that I still remember when you first told me that story, and I'm like, that is just unfortunate that it happened, but it's also very fortunate that we have that story because that's a very, very good example of things that can and have happened and how you can rectify that situation. So
Not a lot of people, I shouldn't say not a lot of people. Some people can't even spill over to that degree. Like if you're an ectomorph and you just burn through calories at a much faster rate, like you wouldn't even know what I'm talking about. You may just get slightly softer appearing and so and just you just never even know what spillover is. Those are the people who probably have a tendency to get flatter quicker because they are using so many calories. Let's get to a final point of, hopefully we're making some headway in understanding glucose and glycogen and how that is a longer form of predicting and controlling how we look. Carbohydrates take time to get digested, and I just gave you an example from my mishap of how that ends up in the muscle tissue over time, but it takes hours and then 24 to 48 hours to fully assimilate into glycogen. So it's a more stable form of solute in the muscle tissue. Well, all of that should be, as I said, much more of a longer term stable mindset. Here's my carbs have been, here's why. I'm still monitoring and assessing and diagnosing if I need any change there. But when it comes to contest day and we're talking about flat versus full, then sometimes I need a quicker hit to remedy how I look right now. And I would say maybe the first half to maybe two-thirds of my career, it would be mostly just water. Like I know where your carbs are, I know where your minerals, your sodium level, potassium levels have been. So we're just going to use water to get fuller. I now am way more apt to using minerals to channel the water much more quickly into the muscle tissue. So, how do you tell a client, like, hey, here are photos, I'm on stage in a couple hours, Austin, and you would say, okay, do this with food, maybe, do this with water, but then do you also direct them to take a certain amount of sodium, potassium, or some kind of a mineral base, together? How do you direct that?
yeah, I mean, obviously, I'll have all of their information, like roughly how much sodium, potassium they're eating in a day. I have my clients have those if-then situations. So, like, I'll have my clients have like salt packets, just a little quick salt packet. Now, I know earlier I said salt and sodium are not the same thing. Well, that's because sodium is in salt, but sodium is also in other foods. So I like to just make sure I clarify that. But the salt packet can be a quick way where it's like, yeah, you are flat. We need some of that salt. We need some water and we can even afford to, based on how they're looking, get some sort of quick carbohydrates in them if need be. But really, I like to do, maybe it's a salt packet with just a few shots of water, start pumping up, a few more shots of water, then kind of see how they're looking. And then we kind of assess and go from there. Again, how much time do they have left before they go on stage? When was their last meal? Could they afford another meal just to keep food going in their system, like you had talked about earlier? So those are kind of some of those if-then things. I know some people will do Gatorades and things like that because you're going to get sodium, potassium, and some quick sugars and that's fine, but some people just don't tolerate those things very well, so I don't like to take that chance. If they can tolerate those things, then that's kind of an emergency also that they might have with them. But I like having like some salt packets, plenty of fluids around, and just extra carbs just in case.
So I've got in the habit of using some mineral packets as well.
Yeah.
Sodium is certainly a thing that's going to give you a direct response. I worry a little bit that that can have its effect, and it's acute. You know, here's sodium, here's water, here's now how I know you're going to look in 15 to 30 minutes. But if we're putting in the other minerals, calcium, potassium, phosphorus, etc., then you're probably going to get a little bit more synergy and those solute gradient changes between inside and outside the cell are probably going to be a little bit more predictable and longer term. So that's one reason I always tell clients, have a Gatorade with you. That's just kind of part of the packing. Have a bottle of Gatorade. Things even like Pedialyte. There are products called Element, literally
Yep.
the
Yep.
letters LMNT. Um, Liquid IV is another. I don't. I mean, there are so many now, but I think you probably want a little bit of experience having these in your body. So maybe part of your mineral base, kind of like you're taking a multivitamin, is you're using a packet of this every day through peak week, getting your body used to a certain amount of all of those minerals together. And then for contest day, like when you would use how much and why, going back to diagnostics. Um, I want to answer this question really quick because you just brought up using carbs again, perhaps. So it's maybe pump up time. Going back to one of my clients and one of our D1 club members who said, well, why even use carbs? Similarly, why do that for pump up? Would I have a Reese's peanut butter cup or some rice cakes or some honey or some vodka or something else? I mean, a lot of people have those things. Pickles, potato chips, coaches and clients are now getting sophisticated trying to find the right combination of carbohydrates with sodium with other minerals. Again, you're trying to spare glycogen. You're about ready to pump up, warm up, go on stage, maybe with a grueling prejudging, and you want to have at least something in transit from your stomach into your small intestine into your bloodstream because again, we're trying to channel what your body's doing with water. So it's not that we're going to give you a magical specific amount of carbs and that's going to quote pump you up in a certain way. It's just going to start directing the water into the muscle cell. And so that's why I'm big on having certainly some simple carbohydrates, but some of this mineral base I'm talking about, maybe even just a little bit of fat to slow down digestion. So, not that any of these things are gimmicky in and of themselves, but when a client says, "Well, can I use something like jelly beans or Skittles or honey, to pump up?" And I'm worried that, well, there's definitely not sodium in that compared to like another type of snack. Sometimes it's just best to have like a half a meal, like an hour before you're going to start pumping up. 2 or 3 ounces of chicken and half a cup of rice with your normal, sodium, condiments, and so forth. Sometimes that's the best because that's a very stable amount of digestion you can count on. But for that final look of pumping up and getting on stage, what are we typically going to see in an Austin Kiergaard client backstage? What are they consuming in the last 30 minutes before they get on stage?
Yeah, I've done like the sugary things because it's got quick sugar. Like you said, we're trying to spare glycogen. They've got like let me think here. My last client, like they might have like a Sour Patch Kids because there's some sodium in there, it's some quick sugars, and they're drinking water, which is fine. I like to make sure people can tolerate certain things. I like doing things like jelly, rice cake, water. If they do have electrolytes, something like that. But uh, It's usually something that's a quicker sugar source. I'm just saying for myself, I like jelly and rice cakes. That's just something I feel good when I'm pumping up. Even the last 30 minutes, it just feels good on my digestion. I don't tolerate a lot of like quick sugar stuff very well. I've done it before, but sometimes it's a stomach ache, sometimes it's not, and I don't like playing that Russian roulette game before I get on stage. But for my clients, I like to make sure that they're drinking plenty of fluids. Sometimes it is like a what are they called? The like the Gatorade Zeros or something like that because they've got the sodium and the potassium in there and there's not a ton of sugar. So I know that they're getting those minerals, those electrolytes, and I know that they've ate about an hour before pumping up. And then if they're feeling good, they're feeling they're getting a pump, then we just kind of keep having them drink that sports drink, if you will. And if they're not, if they're feeling like they're not getting a pump, then I might give them some extra quick carbs and some more fluids as well.
So you generally can't communicate with a client right up to the second they're on stage. I'm assuming with clients, they've got their phone with them while they're pumping up. We can be communicating a little bit. But I also give them some scenarios to walk through. If this, then that. So, I'm going to always assume that, like you said, clients are going to be a little hesitant with water. I know where their carbs have been all week long, and I know how they've looked up to that point. We're exchanging photos and we're assessing photos all the way through. Um, but I'm going to tell them as you start warming up, if you don't feel as full as any of your best workouts this week, if you're just not seeing the shoulders, the back, if you're just not feeling that blood flow, then we have a water issue. Everything we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, Austin. So, what do we need first? We need to make sure you have enough water. Keep sipping, keep drinking, and I might even give them a certain amount. Like, I had told you maybe to sip on 16 ounces for your pump up. If you just don't feel like you're getting there, go all the way up to an extra 16 ounces. But along with that, that's where we may need some of the extra minerals. So now we're adding a little bit of sodium or a mineral packet. That's where you really want to be pretty careful with the amount. I think in terms of 250 milligrams, 500 milligrams, 750, 1,000. I mean, you don't want to be indiscriminate where you're just like pouring a salt shaker on something. But do you have any of those contingencies that you give clients diagnosing themselves in the last 10 minutes before they step on stage?
Uh, That's a good question. So I've been fortunate enough, again, just where I'm at locally, I've been able to be to a lot of client shows. So the clients that I'm not, when I'm not at their shows, yeah, I have everything down to like the last 30 minutes. From that 30-minute marker, that's usually when we're wrapping up our conversation, if it's a quick FaceTime call or a text message or whatever. And then I have it kind of laid out like, here's if you are still at this point, then you need to be doing this until you step on the stage. So they'll know like what they need to do. Um, and then, I mean, I haven't had any issues. The one that is a big concern that I know of, and it's the same thing as you, is water. Yeah, I just know that they're not drinking enough. So I try to always make sure that they're drinking fluids. And I kind of tell them to treat it like a workout. So here's what I'd like you to do for your pump up. When you're done with that, drink some fluids, start pumping up again, drink some fluids. You need to keep, and I think for my clients, they can wrap their head around that a little bit more versus just standing around and just trying to drink a bunch of fluids. And that seems to have worked better for them, at least for the people that I have not been able to be at their shows.
Yeah, that should be looked at as a slow process. You shouldn't be, furiously backstage warming up and expecting everything to happen in 2 minutes. I mean, give yourself the time, 15, 20, 30 minutes to warm up slowly, sip some water, do a set, sip some water. So you're really assessing and diagnosing all the way through, and then you have time to make these changes. One last point on the whole topic of diagnostics, because it doesn't stop once you're on stage. Whether a client has competed in one class that day or two or three different divisions, whether they've competed in more than one contest that year, I'm going to want, just fastidious documentation so that we can debrief and also diagnose where we looked our best. Was there a point in time on that contest day where you could say, okay, on stage I look this way, but man, I really think I looked my best here. Joe, go back and look at those photos I sent you at 10 a.m. or at 4 p.m., 2 hours after the contest. If there is any question, then that's where you want to dig in diagnostically for notes for next time. That what did I do that could have been different? And I'll give you one final example. One of my pro clients, the difference between competing in the morning where he's on stage at 9 a.m. versus not until the afternoon, and now you're talking about how much food you've had during the day, how much hydration. There was a point in time this year with a contest where he just looked both flatter and softer. So for a guy who is as lean as anybody could ever be and just has massive muscle bellies that he just, it's so easy to get him to look his best. We just need to be fully hydrated and have those solutes, the glucose, the glycogen, the minerals in the muscle so it draws the water in. So when I get photos back on a contest day and he's flat and soft, then what's my diagnosis? Well, every single day when you're fully hydrated and we're not even monkeying around with food manipulation, you've just got all the food you need, you have all the sodium you need, you have all the water you can drink, that's when you always look your best. So I can diagnose and say, okay, man, we just really ran behind at that moment. And, maybe we needed another small meal. Maybe we just needed another 32 ounces of water, but we just had to get him fuller. So again, we're channeling the water in the direction we want.
And I think part of that too is the depending on the time, like when we're talking more like show day, like the time they're going to be on stage. Because, some athletes, they might go on right away. So they might be a little bit behind on their water than they normally are because they're going to step on stage at right at 10 in the morning, or opposite, you have people that are going to go on until 10 o'clock at night, and sometimes just you got to really know the times or roughly the time frame your client's going to be on that stage, to really help make sure they're going to be getting enough fluid and food in to their body before they get on that stage.
Yep. Any final thoughts? Anything that you feel like we forgot to cover?
I I don't know, but nothing that we necessarily forgot to cover, but to reiterate the whole mineral aspect. I know we've probably said the word water about 100 times in the last 45 minutes to an hour, but making sure people are paying attention to those minerals as well. A lot of people know sodium. I don't think there's that many that pay attention to potassium or calcium. Those are just extra things to look at, but they are important to have. As we've kind of wrapped up at the very end, just making sure you have those with you as well, whether it's the hydration packets or a low calorie, sports drink that's got sodium and potassium in there as well. Those are things that those can be things that you can remedy a bad situation real quick using those and that water. So just making sure people are paying attention to that, when they get really close. And you brought up a good example too, just to reiterate the peak week, even experimenting, just knowing how much sodium, potassium that you're having throughout that whole week. Like if you're using like a sports packet powder or whatever, um, so that way, come show day, you have been used to using that, not just throwing it last minute. You can, but you know, try to make sure that you're not leaving anything to chance, being prepared.
Yep. To a lot of people watching or listening to this, it's going to be totally asinine and foreign. Like, what the fuck are you talking about to drink that much water on contest day? You've never done it before. It just seems ridiculous. Throw us some questions, even contact us privately because this is information we can give you, just hundreds and hundreds of maybe more specific sessions we've done on the science of this. Go back especially to our peak intel on stage hydration. And feel free, you have a chance to communicate with us even in different ways. Our Contest Prep University D1 Club is a place that for $3 a month, you can be part of this private group. It is a paywall for a reason. We curate information, facilitate conversation with these people. They're not necessarily clients of ours. Sometimes they're coaching themselves. Sometimes they have another coach. We even have coaches in the group who just want to learn from us. So it's a really cool place where Adam Atkinson, Austin, myself, some other staff are in there. and all of the D1 club members are communicating and supporting each other. Just a great learning environment, almost like the old message boards, before social media got rolling. But just a good place to get some extra information and support without paying, normal coaching type prices. So thanks, Austin, and you guys watching. We'll see you next time in Contest Prep University, especially in one of our Peak Intel series. We'll see you next.